Welcome to Deep Fear, Dark Tales, where the most chilling and mysterious stories come to life. Today, we take you to the quiet rural town of Adams, Tennessee, a place where an ordinary farm would become the stage for one of America's most terrifying legends. The Bell family, respected and prosperous, had no idea that their peaceful home would soon be consumed by darkness. John Bell, a man of strength and determination, began to feel that something was wrong. Strange noises and odd feelings invaded the silence of his house. As the head of the Bell family, John always prided himself on his resilience, but even he couldn't ignore the disturbing events that were beginning to unfold. But it was young Betsy Bell who first encountered true terror. She started hearing whispers in the dark, footsteps that seemed to follow her, and the eerie sensation of being watched. The Bell family, once bound by love, was slowly being torn apart by something they couldn't see. As the nights grew longer, their sense of dread intensified. Something sinister lurked in the shadows of their home. And soon, the Bell family would learn the name of the force that haunted them: the Bell Witch. The gentle morning breeze swept through the vast, green fields of the Bell farm, one of the largest and most respected properties in Adams, Tennessee. The church bells could be heard in the distance, blending with the sounds of birds flying over the nearby trees. To any observer, life there seemed peaceful and serene. John Bell, the family patriarch, had built his empire with calloused hands and relentless determination. Alongside his wife, Lucy, he had raised 4 children, and together they maintained the hard and daily rhythm of farm life. The Bell house, a sturdy and simple structure, was a symbol of success in the region. However, in recent months, something disturbing had begun to creep into the family's seemingly perfect routine. It was almost imperceptible at first: a noise on the wooden floor at night, a faint feeling of being watched during the quietest hours of twilight. John, always practical, attributed everything to the aging house or farm creatures hiding in the walls. He kept a firm demeanor, but deep inside, he felt something was changing. His youngest daughter, Betsy, a cheerful and energetic girl, seemed the most affected by these small incidents. She was the first to mention the noises at night, claiming she heard light footsteps going up and down the stairs, even when everyone was already in bed. At first, Lucy thought it was just the girl's imagination. "Old houses make noise, dear," she would say, trying to calm her daughter's fears. However, as days passed, the small disturbances became more frequent. Objects that once were in one place now appeared in another. Nights, once silent, were interrupted by sharp knocks on the walls. The older children, Richard and John Jr., also began to notice something was wrong. Although no one openly talked about it, an atmosphere of discomfort hung over the house. John Bell, always rational, tried to ignore the signs. He continued to manage the farm, negotiate with neighbors, and ensure that this year's harvest would be even more promising than the previous ones. But as the unease grew, he couldn't help but notice that something seemed to be seeping into his life. At night, when everyone slept, John found himself standing in the darkness, listening intently, hoping that the sounds that disturbed his family were just figments of his imagination. At that time, rural life was full of superstitions, and whispers of witchcraft and curses were not uncommon. However, John Bell did not believe in such things. He had always preferred to trust in logic and hard work. But deep down, something was starting to change. He could feel the presence of something invisible, something that seemed to be lurking, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. As days passed, the atmosphere in the Bell house grew increasingly heavy. Betsy began having frequent nightmares, waking up in the middle of the night frightened, claiming to have seen shadows moving in her room. The family, although reluctant, began to realize that what was happening was more than just simple noises. And while everyone tried to keep the routine, a dark sensation hung in the air, as if something was about to happen. The once subtle and sporadic nighttime noises at the Bell farm began to grow more intense and frequent. The entire family started to notice the increasing strangeness that lingered over the house. What initially seemed like the natural wear and tear of an old building quickly turned into something deeper, something none of them could fully understand. However, it was Betsy Bell who suffered the most from the unexplained events. Some nights, she would wake up in a panic, convinced that something was in her room. She described a strange sensation, as if someone was pulling her hair or lightly touching her skin. Terrified, she would cry, and her mother, Lucy, would come to her room, trying to comfort her. But as the days passed, even Lucy began to doubt that this was merely a child's imagination. On one particularly cold night, the silence was shattered by rhythmic knocking that echoed through the walls. John Bell, now in a constant state of alert, immediately rose from his bed. The pounding seemed to come from all directions, as if someone was forcefully striking the walls, yet no one was there. The older children, already disturbed by previous nights, rushed out of their rooms, gathering in the living room, where they exchanged silent, confused glances, unsure of how to react. "This is getting out of hand," John murmured, his brow furrowed. He tried to maintain his composure, but the truth was that even he was beginning to feel powerless against what was happening. In the following days, the events escalated. During the day, the knocking was accompanied by strange sounds, like footsteps echoing from upstairs when everyone was downstairs. The children heard whispers in empty rooms, and each morning, they found objects out of place. Sometimes, the kitchen chairs were overturned, dishes fell off the shelves, and doors opened and closed by themselves. John Bell tried to keep control, but his patience was wearing thin. He began avoiding conversations about the incidents, believing that the more they ignored it, the faster it would all stop. However, Lucy insisted that something needed to be done. She suggested consulting a local clergyman, believing this could be the work of some spiritual entity. In an attempt to calm his wife and protect his family, John Bell invited James Johnson, a respected and devout neighbor, to spend a night at the farm to witness the occurrences. Johnson was skeptical, thinking the reports were exaggerated and attributing the phenomena to collective hysteria. However, as dusk gave way to night, he would soon realize that the rumors were far from fiction. That night, as they all sat at the table, the sounds began again. This time, the knocking was followed by scratching noises that seemed to come from the walls. Johnson glanced at John, who remained silent, his eyes fixed on the worn wood of the floor. The pounding grew louder, and the chair in which James sat was suddenly pulled back, as if an invisible force had dragged it. The silence that followed was even more unsettling. Johnson, clearly shaken, locked eyes with John. I saw what happened," he said in a low voice. "This is the work of something I don't understand, but it's not of this world." With James Johnson's testimony, the stories about the Bell farm quickly spread throughout the community. The people of Adams began to avoid the property, whispering about curses and witchcraft. John Bell, though skeptical of superstitions, could no longer deny that something unusual was happening. He began investigating local stories, searching for a rational explanation, but what he discovered only made him more uneasy. One of the Bell's neighbors, Kate Batts, was known for her eccentricity and unpredictable behavior. Rumors circulated that she practiced witchcraft, and many believed she held a grudge against John over a past land dispute. While John had never believed these stories, he began to consider the possibility that Kate was somehow involved in the strange events. He recalled a conversation with her months earlier when Kate had accused him of deceiving her in a deal. On that occasion, she supposedly cursed him and his family. The suspicions that Kate's witch, as some called her, was behind the events at the Bell farm began to take shape. However, despite the growing rumors, John remained hesitant to take action against Kate. He feared that the stories of curses were merely superstitions fueled by fear. But at the same time, he couldn't ignore the signs that something much darker and more powerful was at play in his home. As the days grew more tense, John's health began to deteriorate. He felt a constant malaise, as if something invisible was draining his energy. What started as small pains and discomfort soon turned into something more severe, and he began to feel an unbearable pressure on his throat, as if he were being choked by unseen hands. The sense of despair gripped the Bell family, as the signs that the danger was just beginning became increasingly clear. The events at the Bell farm had grown increasingly terrifying. It was no longer just strange noises or objects moving on their own. Something far more disturbing had taken hold. The entire family felt a constant presence, as though someone was watching them at all times. Young Betsy Bell, who had seemed to be the entity's focus from the start, began to feel a growing sense of unease. It was a cold October night when everything changed for good. The Bell family was gathered in the living room, trying to pass the time with small tasks. Lucy was quietly sewing while John read an old newspaper, still trying to maintain an appearance of normalcy. Betsy, on the other hand, felt increasingly restless. There was something heavy in the air, and the house, usually warm and welcoming, was filled with a suffocating atmosphere. Suddenly, a loud noise echoed through the house. The doors rattled, and the windows vibrated as though a strong wind was blowing through. Despite the calmness of the night outside, everyone in the room froze, exchanging worried glances. Betsy, sitting near the fireplace, shuddered as she felt a sudden chill. It was at that moment that the entity, which had remained invisible and silent until then, finally made itself known. A deep, drawn-out voice echoed through the house. "I am the witch," the voice said, reverberating off the walls. "And I have come to haunt John Bell." The family froze. The voice was loud and clear, but no one could tell where it was coming from. John, who had always been skeptical and rational, looked around, trying to locate the source of the sound. Lucy, wide-eyed, clutched the fabric in her hands, unsure of how to react. "You cannot see me, but I am here," the voice continued, "and I will not stop." From that night on, the entity was known as the Bell Witch. What had once been just an unsettling presence had now become a real and terrifying threat. The nights at the Bell farm would never be the same. The witch's voice continued to echo through the halls, laughing and mocking the family. Though no one could see the figure responsible, the Bell Witch's presence was undeniable and suffocating. Betsy, visibly shaken, withdrew more and more from the family's activities. She could no longer sleep peacefully, as the whispers and laughter of the entity haunted her night after night. Lucy, worried about her daughter's mental health, tried to comfort her, insisting that this would all pass soon. Yet, even Lucy knew that this was far from over. John Bell, on the other hand, was growing increasingly exhausted. His once steady health began to decline. He felt a constant weakness, an inexplicable fatigue that seemed to drain him more with each passing day. The psychological toll that the Bell Witch exerted on him was immense, and he could no longer find the strength to ignore the signs that something far beyond his understanding was at play. The community of Adams, which had initially dismissed the rumors, soon began talking about the events at the Bell farm. Neighbors started to avoid the property, and whispers of a curse began to spread. The Bell family, once respected and admired, now found themselves isolated, fighting against something no one could explain. The farm, once full of life, now seemed suffocated by an aura of fear. Every step inside the house was accompanied by strange sounds, knocks, scratches, and occasionally the voice of the Bell Witch, always present, always threatening. Despite everything, John still tried to maintain control over the situation. He sought logical explanations for the phenomena and tried to calm his family. But even he knew that the battle against this invisible force was beyond his capabilities. Deep down, he sensed that something terrible was coming, and that the bell which would not stop until she achieved her goal. On one particularly quiet night, as everyone tried to sleep, the voice of the bell which rang out once more. "John Bell, your time is coming," the entity said, followed by a faint, chilling laugh that echoed through the house. John, lying in his bed, heard those words and knew that the days ahead would be the hardest of his life. Time at the Bell farm passed slowly, each day heavier with fear and uncertainty. The Bell Witch, invisible but ever present, continued to torment the family, and everyone knew that the final confrontation between the entity and John Bell was drawing near. The presence of the Bell Witch, once focused on tormenting Betsy, had now fixated entirely on John Bell. The family patriarch felt weaker with each passing day, as his health rapidly deteriorated. The vigor he once had while working on the farm disappeared, and the constant pressure in his throat became unbearable. Each breath felt like a Herculean effort. The farm, which had once been his pride, now felt like a prison surrounded by invisible, incomprehensible forces. Lucy Bell, desperate over her husband's condition, did everything she could to find a solution. She prayed incessantly, begging for protection and healing for her family. Yet, it seemed that the bell which grew stronger with John's suffering. Her appearances, though invisible, became more frequent, and the voice that once whispered now spoke clearly and menacingly. "Your end is near, John Bell," the entity would say, her words dripping with malice. "Your time is coming." John could no longer ignore the grim reality that surrounded him. The once strong and determined man now stood on the edge of exhaustion, both physically and emotionally. Every morning, he woke up with his throat swollen, struggling to breathe, unable to speak for several minutes. His children watched helplessly as the father they once admired became a shadow of his former self. Each night, the attacks grew worse. John began hearing the witch's voice even in his dreams, mocking him as he slept. By day, the weight of his fatigue was overwhelming, and his hands trembled as he tried to perform simple tasks. He withdrew from the daily work of the farm, no longer able to handle the chores he once completed with ease. Every movement was a battle against the weakness that slowly consumed him. Lucy, ever at his side, did her best to keep him comfortable. She spent sleepless nights fearing something terrible might happen while John rested. Many times, she would hear scratching noises along the walls, followed by chilling, cold laughter that seemed to come from every corner of the house. She knew it was the witch, reveling in the suffering she inflicted. The townspeople of Adams had already heard about the situation at the Bell farm. Many avoided the property altogether, fearing they might fall victim to the curse that seemed to grip the family. Rumors about the Bell, which spread even faster after John's visible decline. Some claimed he was being punished for sins from the past, while others believed the farm had been built on cursed land. Despite it all, John refused to leave his home. He felt that, in some way, he needed to confront whatever this force was. Even though his health was failing, his will to resist, though faltering, still remained. He was determined not to be defeated by something he couldn't see, even if it was slowly destroying him. One day, as he lay in bed, too exhausted to stand, John called for Lucy to be by his side. He tried to speak, but the pain in his throat was unbearable. His eyes, however, told a story of desperation and resignation. He knew his time was running out. Lucy, holding his trembling hands, wept silently, realizing her husband was closer to death than she wanted to admit. At that moment, the witch's voice echoed through the room, as though she had heard the unspoken words John couldn't express. "You will die, Lucy, and you know it. Nothing can save him now." Lucy, overwhelmed with fury and despair, screamed at the invisible voice, demanding it leave her family in peace. But the only response she received was the cruel laughter of the witch, echoing throughout the house, amplifying the feeling of helplessness that weighed down on everyone. As the weeks passed, John's health worsened. He could barely get out of bed, and the family watched in horror as their patriarch withered away with each passing day. The farm, once full of life, now felt desolate, with the windows shut tight and the eerie silence broken only by the occasional, mocking laughter of the Bell Witch. John knew the end was near. The constant pressure on his throat, the unexplained pains throughout his body, and the invisible force that tormented him were winning. Even in his clearest moments, he could feel the witch's presence watching him, waiting for the final moment. The Bell farm had become the stage for his agony, and what had once been his home now felt more like a premature grave. And as John Bell's body grew weaker, the Bell Witch was only just beginning. The last weeks of John Bell's life were marked by a suffering that seemed never-ending. He could barely move, confined to his bed where he spent his days in silence, struggling to control the constant pain in his throat. The Bell Witch, as she had promised, gave him no respite. The entity's voice echoed throughout the house more frequently now, filled with malice. "You're almost there, John Bell. The end is near." John's children, deeply shaken, did their best to keep the farm running, but the situation was beyond their control. The harvest had been abandoned, the fields were overgrown with weeds, and the animals were increasingly agitated, as if sensing the malevolent presence that loomed over the property. Lucy, in despair, barely ate, spending her days by her husband's side, holding his hand and praying for a miracle that never seemed to come. On that fateful morning, John was weaker than ever. His face was pale, his eyes sunken, and his body seemed completely drained of the last remnants of energy. He could barely speak, his voice reduced to inaudible whispers. Lucy, always by his side, held his trembling hand, trying to offer comfort, though she herself was on the verge of collapse. It was then that the Bell Witch decided to make her final, cruelest appearance. As the day dragged on, the entity's voice echoed through the house with a chilling clarity. "John Bell, you've heard me. I came to kill you, and today is the day." The voice, deep and cutting, made Lucy and the children tremble with fear. The sound of pounding on the walls, which had been sporadic before, now echoed like relentless hammering, reverberating through the entire house. John opened his eyes with great effort, his lips moving slightly but producing no sound. Lucy leaned in closer, trying to hear what he wanted to say. She's here," he whispered, struggling. "She'll never stop." Lucy tried to speak, but her voice failed. Tears streamed down her face as the helplessness consumed her heart. She knew her husband was right. The Bell Witch would not rest until she fulfilled her cruel promise. Suddenly, a loud noise echoed through the house. Chairs in the living room were violently dragged across the floor, and dishes in the kitchen began falling from the shelves, shattering on the ground. The children rushed into John's room, panic etched across their faces, finding Lucy trembling beside the bed. The pounding on the walls grew more intense, and it felt as if the entire house was on the verge of collapse. "I told you he would die by my hand," the Bell Witch thundered, her voice louder than ever. "John Bell, your time has come." At that moment, Betsy, visibly terrified, screamed, begging the witch to stop. "Please leave him alone. It's enough. Leave my father alone." But the only response she received was a sharp, almost deafening laugh that echoed throughout the house, sending chills down her spine. Lucy and the children watched in horror, powerless, as John lay on the bed, seemingly fighting one last time against the invisible force that had tormented him. His breathing was labored, each breath a struggle that seemed to tear at his chest. The pressure in his throat, which had plagued him for months, was now crushing, and he could barely keep his eyes open. The Bell Witch, unseen but ever present, continued to mock her victim. "You cannot escape me, John Bell. No one can." And then, with a final breath, John Bell succumbed. His body relaxed, his hand slipping from Lucy's grasp, and the room fell into a deathly silence. The family stood frozen for a moment, unable to accept what had just happened. The only sounds were the frantic beating of their own hearts and the faint clinking of shattered glass still rolling across the kitchen floor. Lucy, in shock, held her husband's lifeless body and began sobbing uncontrollably. The children, equally devastated, surrounded their father's bed, a scene of grief and despair overtaking them. The farm, once filled with life, was now consumed by a heavy silence, broken only by the family's weeping. But the Bell Witch wasn't satisfied with just John's death. Minutes after his final breath, a small, strange bottle was found beside his bed. Inside was a dark, unknown liquid. No one knew how the bottle had appeared there, nor what its contents meant. Desperate for answers, the children decided to test the liquid on one of the farm animals. They poured a few drops into the mouth of a cat, which immediately began convulsing and died within minutes. The meaning was clear: it was poison. The Bell Witch had not only tortured John for months, but, in the end, had poisoned him. And then, as if her task had been completed, the Bell Witch's voice echoed through the house one final time. "My mission is done. John Bell is dead, and so it will be for anyone who crosses my path." The silence that followed was almost as terrifying as the witch's voice. The Bell family stood paralyzed, unable to comprehend the horror they had just witnessed. Yet, there was a strange calm in the air, as if the entity that had tormented them for so long had finally left the house. The Bell farm, once a symbol of success and happiness, was now the site of an unimaginable tragedy. John Bell's name would be remembered not only for his hard work, but for the dark and terrible way his life had ended. And although the Bell Witch had declared her mission complete, the Bell family knew they would never truly be free of the entity's shadow. There was something in the air, something invisible but palpable, that suggested the witch had not left for good. After John Bell's death, a strange silence descended upon the farm. The menacing presence of the Bell Witch, which had tormented the family for months, seemed to have vanished with John's final breath. The nights, once filled with pounding noises and malicious whispers, were now quiet, as though the entity had finally been satisfied. Lucy Bell and her children tried to move on, but the scars left by the events were too deep to erase. The farm, once alive with work and laughter, was now a place of shadow and desolation. Every room in the house carried memories of the attacks. The witch's dark laughter and John's suffering echoed in their minds. The community of Adams soon began whispering about the happenings. The tales of the Bell Witch spread quickly, and the story of John Bell's death transformed into a legend that traveled far beyond the small town's borders. Locals avoided the farm, fearing that the vengeful spirit might still linger, waiting to strike anyone who dared to approach. Betsy Bell, who had been the primary target of the witch for so long, bore the trauma of those events. Once vibrant and full of life, she now lived in seclusion, haunted by the memories. She never fully recovered from the attacks and the endless nights of terror. The shadow of the Bell Witch lingered over her, even though the witch's voice was no longer heard. Even with the apparent silence, there was a lingering sense that the witch had not left for good. It is said that before her final manifestation, the Bell Witch promised to return one day. And so, fear persisted among the local townspeople, who always regarded the Bell farm with suspicion, believing that the evil could reawaken at any moment. The legend of the Bell Witch continued to grow over time, told and retold by generations. John Bell's name became etched in history, not for his achievements as a farmer, but for the dark fate he met at the hands of an invisible entity. And even today, on quiet nights, there are those who swear they hear whispers carried by the wind, as if the bell which still lingers nearby, patiently waiting for her next victim.
If you enjoyed this video and want more content like this, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and give it a like. Your support is really important to us and motivates us to bring more amazing stories. Thank you for watching.